This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. This is what we love about the South, call and response. It's wonderful. Welcome, and thank you very much for coming today. And thank you for those of you who've been waiting for a few minutes. Thank you very much for your patience. So we got a surprise announcement yesterday that there was going to be some busyness on the Clifton corridor, and they seem to have minimized it. But thank you for those of you who have traveled and made the effort to get here, and for those who have waited a few minutes. My name is Sita Ranchad-Nilsson. I direct Emory's Institute for Developing Nations. The Institute is a partnership between Emory and the Carter Center. And we bring together scholars and policymakers and practitioners on a variety of development issues, particularly those issues that our partners at the Carter Center are working on. I want to especially welcome our colleagues who are here with the Rosalind Carter Fellowship for Mental Health Journalism. We've been talking about this collaboration for a long time, and I know you had to make some extra effort to get here today, so I really want to welcome the fellows, members of the advisory board, and our colleagues from the Carter Center. I'm particularly grateful to Rebecca Palpont-Shimkutz for working with us all these months to make this happen. The idea for this conversation came about after IDN brought Lauren Wolfe to Emory last year to talk about her work on sexual violence and conflict in Syria. In conversations with Lauren and colleagues from Emory and the Carter Center, we were really struck by the fact that journalists and public scholars working on issues of conflict and trauma face many of the same challenges. For those of you who may not be familiar with the term public scholars, it refers to scholars who deliberately take their research and their work outside of their disciplinary confines and outside the university to engage with policymakers, influence public opinion, and work with social movements. Pamela Scully, who is one of our panelists today, directs Emory's Center for Faculty Development and Excellence, and they regularly do just wonderful programs for our faculty on advancing public scholarship. And I should say that Pamela herself is quite the prolific public scholar. So this is an area that we're very interested in. For journalists and public scholars working on conflict, human rights, trauma, and mental health, the new and rapidly evolving information environment presents new responsibilities and new challenges, and also, I think most exciting for us, new opportunities for collaboration. And I'm really pleased to have this very distinguished panel here today to talk about these issues. I'd like to take just a moment to introduce the moderator of the panel, and then I will ask her to introduce the individual panelists. Our moderator today is Ioana Avadani. She is Executive Director of the Center for Independent Journalism in Bucharest, Romania. She has over 15 years of experience in the media as a news agency editor, TV editor, and media developer with the Center for Independent Journalism. Ioana has coordinated programs ranging from advocacy for transparency and accountability of public authorities to press freedom and protection of journalists. She was instrumental in passing critical legislation to increase public access to information and has served as the president of the Southeast European Network for the Professionalization of the Media. I'm very grateful to her for stepping into this role as moderator, and Ioana, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. The grateful one should be me for having the opportunity to be here in the presence of such wonderful people and so impressive people. And you know, I I know to calibrate my words, and I'm not easily impressed. Still, I'm impressed by the components of this panel, and allow me to introduce these wonderful persons here. First, we have Lauren Wolfe, an award-winning journalist, author of for numerous publications, including The Atlantic and The New York Times. She is currently a columnist for Foreign Policy magazine and the director of the Women's Media Center's Women Under Siege project, a journalism project on sexualized violence. I learned this term from you. In 2012, Lauren testified at the United Nations on her team's finding on rape in Syria and presented them to the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office. She has reported from many conflict areas in the Middle East, Central Africa, and Central America. Next to her is Pamela Scully. She's a professor in the departments of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and African Studies here at Emory. She has written extensively on humanitarian interventions, transitional justice, and sexual violence. Pamela is working on a book on sexual violence, humanitarian interventions, and transitional justice with a focus on Liberia, and has just completed a biography of President Ellen John Sirleaf that will come out with Ohio University Press. Pamela teaches courses on gender, violence, and genocide, genealogies of feminist thought, and feminist approaches to international human rights. Right? Further on, Sabrina Karim, a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science at Emory University. Her research interests include conflict, security sector reform, peacekeeping, and gender. She recently returned from fieldwork in Liberia and has written a number of op-eds on the Ebola crisis. Before coming to Emory, Sabrina was a Fulbright scholar in Lima, in Peru, where she conducted research on women in the Peruvian National Police. She also organized women in one of Lima's poorest communities to create a women's cooperative. Last but not least, and for the sake of gender balance, Bill Lichtenstein, familiar to many of you here. His work as an award-winning print and broadcast journalist and documentary producer spans over 40 years. He is founder and president of Lichtenstein Creative Media. Since 1990, LC Media has created national media productions and groundbreaking public education campaigns to foster positive, measurable changes in public attitudes, behaviors, and policies regarding mental health. He taught investigative reporting for TV and documentary film at the New School for Social Research. Bill currently serves as an advisory board member for the Carter Center's Rosalind Carter Fellowship for Mental Health Journalism, and this is how we got to know him. With these wonderful people around, I think that we should waste no more seconds, and I would invite all you panelists to describe in the space of 3 to 4 minutes your experience and the connections between your experience, you as persons, and our topic today.
Hi, thanks everyone for being here. You know a little about my professional background, but I think the thing that's not in my bio is that I come from a pretty traditional journalism background, did J school, all that stuff, and didn't quite know what I was going to cover. But early on, an editor discovered that I was the writer who knew how to make people cry, so I was given the stories that would do that. And it turned out that I really liked looking at the more difficult side of things. So I went on and I actually worked at the New York Times specifically on September 11th projects, which kind of got me steeped in trauma journalism and how you talk to survivors, how you kind of pull out a story that's very complex in a crisis situation and try, you know, a couple years later to determine what happened in this room on the 103rd floor of the North Tower or whatever it was we were working on. And I went on from there to move into advocacy, where I was a senior editor at the Committee to Protect Journalists. So I kind of had a few years where I worked on behalf of journalists under duress around the world. But I moved back toward what I really love to do, which is writing about the kind of silences and the interstices, like the places where nobody wants to kind of look or talk about. And it specifically led me to the Women's Media Center working on this project, Women Under Siege, which was created by Gloria Steinem as a way of telling an undertold history about sexualized violence and conflict. The idea being that perhaps we could learn something if we actually knew what the history consisted of. And part of that is that I've been live tracking sexualized violence in Syria. And as we talked about at our panel last night, Syria has such a unique aspect to it because there's such stigma around sexualized violence. There are honor killings and divorce and all sorts of repercussions against women who've been raped. So documenting this has been an incredible challenge, but it's also what drives me because these women are suffering doubly. They're being punished for having been raped. My work at Foreign Policy really is focusing more on trauma issues, so maybe that's more connected to what some of you do. I was recently in Rwanda, and I left that country trying to figure out how to tackle the most complicated trauma issue that I had come across, just how a whole country survives a genocide, and 20 years later, you know, it's like walking around with ghosts. So I came back and kept thinking to myself, like, how am I possibly going to do this, but how am I not going to write about this? So I actually did a piece for The Atlantic that I'd love y'all to read. I'd love to hear what you think, because it was one of those things where I felt like I was just going to give it a go. So I spoke to the advocacy people, and I spoke to some amazing psychiatrists, psychologists. If you know Frank Ochberg, he's an amazing voice in this field, founded the DART Center. And then I've also been covering, in terms of Syria, not just sexualized violence, but the severe lack of mental health care, because everywhere I've gone at the border, refugees are suffering so severely, and I would meet, you know, the one psychiatrist for hundreds of miles around, treating thousands of people. So the need has been so great. So I've been trying to figure out how to translate the need that I see, you know, in terms of mental health and in terms of trauma into journalism, and that requires really working with the advocates and really understanding the research, so working with the scholars. So I really do feel like what I do is sort of a fine line in between all of them, and I feel like journalism could use more of that personally, I think. But then I'll just end up with the fact that I sometimes get asked, people write to me after I publish a story and they say, yes, but what are you doing to actually help these women? So I spend a lot of my time kind of trying to convince myself that what I'm doing is hopefully helping these women. But you know, guess we're here to talk about that. So, thank you.
I'll take Lauren's cue and just tell you a little bit about myself. So I grew up in South Africa. I'm an apartheid product, and but even sort of came of age, I guess, as apartheid was crumbling. But even then, it was clear that in at least in anti-apartheid circles in South Africa, the link between academic interests and social and civic engagement were considered to be absolutely what you did. And then I met an American, et cetera, still happily with the American, many years later, but came to this country and did my PhD at the University of Michigan in comparative women's history, which I loved. And one of the things for a while that I loved was in America, it's a very different approach, which is that if you're an academic, you have to be objective, et cetera, and it's not acceptable to be civically engaged in terms of your research, I think. So for about 10 years, I just wrote books on the 19th century, et cetera, but then Yugoslavia happened and Rwanda happened. And then at the same time I had lots of, well, not lots, 2 babies, and the 90s disappeared. But the 90s disappeared with all these incredible events, you know, traumatic, terrible, and wonderful events happening, because, you know, Rwanda genocide started almost as South Africa, you know, had its first democratic election. But I woke up in the early 2000s, and I realized I'd missed one of the most significant decades, you know, of the 20th century, because I was basically trying to get my, you know, tenure and devote some time to my babies. So then I came to Emory in 2004 and realized that I really had an opportunity to, in a way, reinvent myself. I now had tenure. I was in women's studies. Previously, I'd been in history departments. And so I started teaching classes in order to teach myself about what I'd missed in the 90s. And I felt one of the things I'd really missed paying attention to was sexual violence and genocide. So I started teaching undergraduate courses on that, and was supposed to be writing a book actually based in the 15th century about contacts between indigenous people and how women, whatever. And then realized that really I woke up just longing to go and teach my classes, which were on topics such as violence and trauma and horrible things like that, but I felt they were meaningful, and that my research just was increasingly feeling irritating. So then I had this epiphany that maybe I could put the research together, and in the meantime, under CETA's direction, we went on a working group trip to Liberia at the invitation of the Carter Center to look at their rule of law work. And the Carter Center was coming across lots of, again, accounts of sexual violence from the Civil War that ended in 2003, and also contemporary, people talking about domestic violence. And they thought it would be helpful to have some outside experts to just see what they were doing and give them advice. It turned out they were doing really fabulous stuff, so I'm not sure I had a whole lot of advice. But it did, again, reanimate my sense that I wanted to work more in the present around issues of sexual violence and justice. So since then, that was 2008, I got involved in that, and I've started writing. As I said, I've just finished this book on Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. One of the things that troubled me when we were in Liberia the first time was that the Carter Center was really is a fabulous organization. They try to do things right. They work with people in country, they hire people in country, and they seemed so different to what one was seeing among many of the other international NGOs, which sort of seemed to wander around various places in the world, telling people what to do, talking about partnership, but not actually being partners. And so as a result of that, I thought it was really important that as academics and researchers, we try to bring people, in the case of Liberia, who really are doing the work on the ground and know what they are doing, together with academics to think about new ways of moving forward. So again, in partnership with IDN and CETA, we organized some workshops on whether gender even means anything in Liberia, whether it's a helpful term, what does human rights mean, how can Liberians try to articulate their own needs and try and get funding that way. So I've worked with some women's groups to get funding from various places in the United States. And so I guess that's where I am now. I think, I've got some notes here. Yes, I think in the end, what I'm really interested in is how we can think about writing about issues of trauma and sexual violence sensitively in the academic world and elsewhere, and also how we navigate that path between or away from, I think, the trend that I read that really, really worries me in international development, even among humanitarian agencies trying to do their best, which is to come with models of let's say even of healing, of psychotherapy that derive from traditions of society, notions of individual versus community, etc., that really derive from, let's say, New York or Vienna, as opposed to trying to embed healing within the communities themselves, who might have very, very different ideas about even whether an individual is an individual, and to stop, really to figure out new ways of doing this in a sensitive way. Thank you.
Thank you. Sabrina, please.
Great, thank you everyone for coming today. So as I'm listening to Lauren and Pamela, one of the things that strikes me is the importance of personal experience in that driving a lot of the things that we do. And so I thought I would start by my own personal experience, which has driven a lot of the things that I've done in my life. So I'm the daughter of refugee parents that came to the US from Bangladesh during the Civil War. And so I grew up hearing stories of the Civil War and my parents escaping, and that has driven a lot of my interests. Which then, so I study conflict, security sector, and peacekeeping and gender. So I started out doing a bachelor's, doing my master's in forced migration or refugee studies, and then I went to work as a community organizer in Denver with immigrant undocumented women. And as I was doing that, I discovered, or as I got to know these women, that a lot of them had experienced a lot of trauma, mostly dealing with sexualized violence and mostly domestic violence. I then went to Lima, Peru, and discovered the same thing. I worked with women's organizations there. And so this was this reoccurring theme in my life that a lot of the women that I was coming into contact with, they had experienced this type of violence. There just wasn't a lot of information or research done on these types of things. So I started a PhD program here at Emory 4 years ago. Now I'm a fourth-year PhD student and have since focused most of my attention on learning about the condition of women in conflict situations and post-conflict situations. I've had the opportunity, because of Sita and Pamela, actually to go to Liberia my first year, and I've now been there 10 times since in 2 years. Most recently, a month ago, so I am officially in my 3-week period, so I don't have Ebola. And I got a chance to write about the situation on the ground. There weren't, at the time when I was there were about 2 reporters that I knew of that were reporting from the ground. You know, you have the byline of the person and where they're from. And a lot of, I don't know if you noticed, but a lot of them were, you know, they were from Accra or other places, and there were very few people in Monrovia. So I thought it was really important and my own responsibility to report what was happening. So responsibility is kind of the key word that I want to bring up here also, because as a researcher, and I think as journalists, we're going to talk a lot more about what our responsibility is when we're in these types of situations. I feel as a researcher that my responsibility is to get the most accurate information out there, but at the same time, there's a lot of issues that come along with that responsibility that we're going to get to talk about today. But I think that's enough. Please.
It's a pleasure to be on this panel, and we've done a fair amount of talking already, particularly about the difference between what I'll call just the facts journalism, the who, what, when, where, how of a story, and what I'll refer to as advocacy journalism, where the person writing the story interjects beyond that in some way, and to try to, it's given me the opportunity to really think about, particularly covering mental health, what that means. My own story is that in the 1980s, I was a producer at ABC News. I was diagnosed in a relatively short period of time, came down with, was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. When I got better, before the internet, what one did when one wanted to know more about a problem was to go to Barnes & Noble, went to the self-help section, and was stunned to find out in the mid-80s that there were no books really about mental health. There were no books about recovery from mental health and mental illness. There was one little thin book about the introduction of lithium into North America by Ron Phoebe, but this was before Kay Jameson's great book and Patty Duke's great book. There really was nothing, and I ended up in the early 90s doing a series of 3 public radio shows that were the first to feature people who had not only gotten sick but recovered from a serious mental illness, and they got a lot of attention. It's almost impossible to believe nowadays when you can turn on the TV at any hour of the day or night and find somebody talking about some mental health issue or addiction issue. There really was nothing like this at the time. And they went beyond just the stories to focus on 3 things. What are these illnesses, and if they were illnesses, that they're treatable, and that people do recover. Those were the 3 sort of takeaways that we brought to the discussion. In the 20 years since then, as a journalist covering mental health, and I just made a short list of the kinds of things that go beyond just the facts, generally I would concern myself with trying to increase public knowledge of whatever the problem is recovering, increase diagnosis and treatment among those who might be reading the story, where to get help, how widespread, what are the statistics accurately, that these are real illnesses, that people can recover, that people should not be discriminated against for having these illnesses, and efforts to reduce stigma, which really comes up a lot of things. And as you can see, there's a significant overlap between journalism and research in these areas, because a lot of what journalists are looking for comes out of research. I think there's a broader question about the responsibility, particularly of media, in the area of mental health, and I think it stems from the role the media plays in framing public discussion on mental health and mental illness. We did an anti-stigma campaign for the city of New York in the mid-90s or early 90s. It was the first effort by a city to try to change the attitudes about mental health. And we brought to bear a lot of the same resources you would if you were trying to sell Nikes or Pepsi, and tapped into major ad agencies. And we did research for the campaign, and we did quantitative research where we called 500 people at home at night and asked, do you know anybody with serious mental illness, and what do you think should be done? And more than 50% were willing to actually admit to a stranger on the phone, so the number was probably higher, said yes they did, and that more tax money should be spent, more should be done to help people thinking of the person they knew who had this issue. We then did focus groups and qualitative research. We brought together people who were in a position to help people with mental illness, judges, HR executives, and who also said they didn't know anybody with mental illness. And when we asked, what do you think about when you think about the mentally ill, the needle swung the other way, and it was all about, the guy in the ATM that I can't go into anymore, and the homeless guy that stabbed the pregnant nurse with a pencil, and then somebody said, well, that was on ER, and oh, that's right. So even getting fiction and reality mixed up, but these images grossly drove people's attitudes. And what we realized was that people were making decisions based on the 0.0001% of people with mental illness that they saw, and that were very, in some cases, dramatic, and they weren't seeing the 99.999% of people who may be taking medication and just weren't as visible. And then, when we asked, where do you get these images from, in almost every case, it was the media, front page of the New York Post, movies, TV. So, the media inherently has a role in shaping public attitudes about mental health, and I would argue, therefore, has responsibility to address them. Just in closing, one of the things we looked at this week in our discussions amongst ourselves was an article on domestic violence, and raising the same question about advocacy in the context of domestic violence, and I think the answers sort of overlay this to a large extent. And the question was, when you're reporting on domestic violence, where should you go beyond just the facts to offer additional information? And there were four, in this article in the Global Post recently, there were four areas that I think resonate with mental health. Focus on cause and prevention in the story so that the reader better understands what causes these illnesses and that they can be prevented. To stay away from stigmatizing language and stereotypes that drive public beliefs. That stories often tended to be linked to a violent incident, and that the writing was just about that incident without giving a larger context. And the need to include solutions in the stories. So I think those are all, from my perspective, sort of reasonable approaches, even though they go beyond sort of the objective journalist voice in a story. And I think that's one of the things we'll do today is talk about, how to broaden the scope of reporting on mental health issues.
Thank you very much, everybody. We have already a couple of key words on the table. We have research, we have reporting or journalism, we have advocacy, and in order to complicate the landscape, I would add to this new media, which changes basically what we knew about reporting, what we knew about research, I assume, and definitely what we knew about advocacy. So my first, we will base the conversation that follows on three directions. First of all is how new media changes our ways of doing our respective jobs. Then a word that was already mentioned a couple of times, how new media affect our responsibilities and in the new environment, our obligations and responsibilities. And the third, which is my personal favor, challenges and opportunities. I don't know what we would do in conversations like this without this point, challenges and opportunities. So, distinguished panelists, allow me to formulate a basic question that I would like to hear your opinion on. Does the proliferation of ways to share information change how journalists and public scholars, we are a combination of those, navigate or balance objectivity and advocacy? So we already voiced the idea that we have to balance advocacy and objectivity, or we have to choose. Actually, that was the drama, because at a certain point we were pushed to choose. How do we walk the line between reporting and advocacy? This is a question for all the journalists in the room. In particular, reflecting on the work you have already done on violence or trauma, so we are adding another layer of complication to our question. What are the unique issues that you face in terms of balancing objectivity and advocacy, especially when words concrete with personal experience? So please, feel free.
Well, I would just start out by saying that I am constantly battling a label of what I am, because I call myself a journalist, but other people like to call me an activist or an advocate. And I find it very strange because my medium is journalism. But what I've found is when you write about human rights and women's rights specifically, you're called an advocate when you're a woman. Pamela and I have talked about this. There's a sort of gendered way of looking at female journalists to some degree. And I asked a friend of mine, Helen Benedict, she's a professor at Columbia who's written a lot about sexual violence in the military, how she deals with that. She said, oh, people do that to me all the time. She said, my response is that I say I do a traditional expose and I uncover things. And if they want to call me whatever they want to call me, that's fine. But what I would say back is if you think about a photojournalist, a man who is documenting something like child soldiers, you don't think of him as an activist, you think of him as a journalist, right? So I think from the very beginning, it's a very funny thing occupying this space for myself, at least, doing this work on sexualized violence and conflict, because while I publish in mainstream outlets, I've also got a nonprofit project at a nonprofit place called the Women's Media Center, and what we're doing is journalism, yet it's considered activism, but I still can't find the flip side of rape. Like, are there sites that are pro-rape? Like, you know what I mean? Like, you're just sort of pointing out a human rights violation. So I would just be interested to hear more about like how we classify these things, why there's sort of a distinguishing line, and what those lines are.
And I would say, so my home department, thank you. Thanks so much. My home department is Women, Gender and Sexuality Studies, and I have a joint appointment with African Studies. And I think, in a way, as a field, women's studies has always, has really rejected the idea that you can't be both personal and objective. Mm-hmm. But the flip side is always accused of being a little too political, a little not neutral enough. And I guess I've just sort of embraced that, I see things differently, and that the contribution of feminism and women's studies to the world is precisely to take things that are considered either too personal or they're not really neutral or something, and say actually they're part of life, and we have to find ways to talk about them, which is why I so appreciate Lauren's work. So I think one of the challenges I see is partly that we live in a world also where quantitative reasoning and statistics and metrics and numbers, and it just is overwhelmingly how you're supposed to be in the world. And to say that actually, personal stories really matter, and that telling a story really well about a survivor of rape or indeed a child soldier is not to dumb down the question, but is to reveal really important content that allows us to both empathize with people and also to explain it better to a wider public. So I can either get kind of really irritated by the idea that one is not being neutral, but actually I've just embraced the idea that there are different ways of articulating information and discussing it, and that depending on one's goal, all have merit.
And one of the things that I had raised in our pre-discussion was the concept of journalism for the public good. Is that considered advocacy? I just wonder sometimes if we're using different terms for the same thing, or if this is something that's really shifting in the way we're presenting information.
And actually, I just had a question when Bill was talking, saying, is advocacy actually just another word for analysis? Because, if you're really trying to explain why something happened and help communicate to a public whatever the issue is, be it a shooting or whatever, surely being able to provide a broader analytic context for why is part of responsible journalism. And so I wonder, I think, as Lauren's remarks suggest, it's actually a cheap shot to call anything you don't like advocacy. It's really that you're just not comfortable with either the topic or the explanation.
Along this theme, I want to step back and talk about two different audiences that we have. So the audience that we've been talking about are the public, the people that read what we write. There's also a responsibility and this ambiguous role for the people that we write about as well. So with the first along the lines of what we've been talking about for researchers, about, I think it was 9 months ago, Nick Kristof wrote a column about how political scientists, their work was just not policy relevant, or they weren't very good at asking questions that were important for policy making. And there was a huge slew of responses by political scientists defending, the work that they do. And it really brought to light a number of things, new media, and how political scientists have started using new media as a way to advocate or to show the work that they're doing. So I just wanted to highlight a few. There's a number of blogs. The Washington Post picked up something called the Monkey Cage, for example. There's a number of other blogs that have been picked up by bigger news sources. Twitter is explosive amongst political scientists as well. So this new media has really given political scientists a way to make their work policy relevant for this broader public. Jumping to the other audience, the audience about the people that we write about, especially in the context of vulnerable populations, we have a responsibility to be very careful there as well, because there's a lot of expectations that people have often when you tell them that you're writing about them. This has come up for me in multiple ways of whenever I go into the field in Liberia, people ask me, well, you're doing this survey or you're interviewing us, what am I going to get out of this?
I get that all the time.
Yeah. So what is this going to do for me? I'm sharing this really personal thing that happened to me in my life, and I'm not getting anything for it. So there's different ways to answer that question and different things to say. I've approached it in a number of different ways, which I'd be happy to talk about later. But it's just I just wanted to bring up that there's two different audiences that we should be thinking about.
I think in terms of looking at it as journalism, at the heart of it is what the story or what we're doing is the journalism accurate? Is it balanced? Is it fair? And I think those are issues that separate it from propaganda, which is I want to make this point and motivate people, so I'm going to just use whatever tools I can, to sort of mold the story to get that response. So I think at the heart, it's clear most of what, that this is journalism, the kinds of reporting that's done on mental health is journalism. I do think there's this sort of, in coming from the generation that grew up watching the Vietnam War, there's this sort of myth that facts are objective and facts are the purest form of journalism. Thinking back to Vietnam, when body counts and weekly, you turn on the news each night and find out how many Americans and how many enemy soldiers were dead, and that was the extent of the coverage for a long time. It really told you nothing about what was going on in Vietnam, and it wasn't until it was in a broader context and you started to really understand. So I think facts alone are not a fallback to say that's journalism versus having more context. I do think, in thinking about it, what a lot of us working in covering mental health try to do at its heart is to tell the stories of people who are experiencing these issues or providing a window on their experience. And I think that's hugely important because I think it allows people to feel empathy and compassion and to extend themselves. I think most of us, if one heard, God forbid, that a friend or relative, had a car accident or had cancer, there's a sort of human response that you would expect people would have, and yet if somebody says, oh, my child was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, borderline personality disorder, for general public, it's hard to sort of know what those are, and I think it's hard for people, to extend themselves. And I think by providing a window on it and making it more understandable what it's like to experience these things, it opens up a lot of things. Mike Wallace was quoted in a book by Kathy Cronkite, it's Walter Cronkite's daughter, talking about mental health and the problem with people extending themselves. And he said, and I really believe this to be true, he said, I don't think most people are mean-spirited or hard of heart when it comes to mental health. They just don't know. And if they did know, they certainly would say, what can I do to help? And I think a lot of what people try to do, if there's any kind of takeaway that people hope for the stories, it's when people read a story or see a film or read a book, that they'll come away with a better understanding of what that person's going through and help create bridges and more ability to extend themselves.
Thank you very much for your thoughts. I picked from you, I think, the idea that we can talk about public good journalism. But isn't journalism supposed to be performed or practiced for the sake of public good? This is the very definition. We don't have to invent something else. But I feel you, and I agree with you that it becomes more and more difficult for us as journalists to defend our job. Now, we have these new technologies that ease a little bit the pressure of the constraints of limited space in the page of a newspaper or the limited amount of time on air. We have zillion of pixels available, megabytes available to us to express ourselves. At the same time, we have another kind of pressure, from time pressure, meaning that we have to deliver quick, we have to deliver now, because this is what our audience is, and I use the plural deliberately. This is what our audiences expect from us. New information, fresh information now, and information and opinion, I would say. This kind of balancing, more space but more time pressure, created new obligations for us, created new responsibilities, as the word was uttered here several times. Well, let's start with Bill.
And so the question is what has new media, what's the net effect of new media? I think this is, the question of the day for not just journalism, but for most professions, is what is the impact of new media. I think, just speaking personally, yes, it's easier to get things into print and out to people. I think it's easier as a reporter to find information, to find somebody dealing with a particular issue. In the old days, you'd have to contact, a group or a clinician dealing with a subject, and you might have to get on a plane and go fly someplace and have coffee with somebody. It's much easier now to locate people and be able to speak with people who are dealing with various things and to get statistics and information. But I also think that sort of it's gotten soft around the edges. There's so much stuff being written and so much stuff out there. It's kind of hard to, I think to be heard above the clutter. So I'm not sure it expressly affects the extent to which people are writing advocacy or not advocacy, but I think you're swimming in a sea of first-person accounts and advocacy, and so I think you have to be doubly introspective about what you're doing and how you're placing it, and what you're doing with the information. But it certainly makes it much easier to get information, and also for people dealing with problems to find other people that have similar situations. So it's I think a more supportive environment in general.
So, as many of you might know, researchers, it takes a very long time for us to write anything. In fact, it takes about 2 years from starting a project for it to get published. So it's not the quick and instantaneous thing that the public demands. So what can you do in this context if you're a researcher and unfortunately your research will be published 2 years after you start? So I thought of 2 different things that maybe researchers might have the responsibility of doing because it takes such a long time. The first is, when you do get to this 2-year mark, you should always, by rule of thumb, I've heard, people have told me, that for whatever article you write, you should also publish something that's in a more mainstream journalistic magazines, like The Atlantic or Foreign Policy or whatever. So every article should be accompanied by something that's more mainstream. Second, in this 2-year interim period, if you go out into the field, then you do have a responsibility to be an expert while you're in the field. So find the journalists that happen to be on the ground. So in Liberia, I found the journalists that were on the ground, and we were constantly texting each other about the information about Ebola that we had, the most up-to-date information. So you are considered an expert on that country, so you also have a responsibility to report on it, even if it's not the research that you're doing, but whatever might be happening in that particular country. So those are 2 ways to be quick if you're a researcher.
And I would totally endorse the challenge for academics who move in glacial time as opposed to journalists who don't. So one of the opportunities, I guess, with new media, and I'm thinking also in the academic sense of online education, is in terms of being able to bring one's research to a wider public, the new sort of format of MOOCs, massive online open courses or something. So recently a colleague and I, Deb Howry, who's in the School of Medicine, and she's an emergency physician, and I have put together a Coursera course called Understanding Violence. And it currently has 25,000 plus people enrolled, which is basically double Emory is enrolled in one course. It's sort of ridiculous numbers. But why we wanted to do that was we brought together experts, including Rebecca, from different points of view, different expertise to talk about violence. And I think that's really one way in which academics can bring their work to a much broader audience. It's not a course for credit, it's just really educating the general public. And also for us, or for me in particular, I've learned so much from people like Rebecca and other colleagues who have done lectures for this course, because one learned a whole bunch of things. So I think MOOCs, the whole opportunity to do things online, really creates new forums for putting out information, for interacting with people. I'm emailing with someone in American Samoa. It's just fantastic. Anyway, the other thing I would say, and Sabrina and I did this together with another colleague called Erin, is we saw Women Under Siege, and I actually used the Women Under Siege site about sexualized violence and conflict in my classes. And it's really a fantastic resource, and we noted that it had pages on different conflicts, but not one in Liberia. And so I sort of basically wrote to Lauren, who I did not know, and said, would you be interested in a conflict page on Liberia? And she said, yes, that'd be great. And so we, over a course of about a year, put together the conflict page. And that felt a really worthwhile thing to do, to use the kind of skills we had as academics and the research we were doing to put it up onto a really worthwhile site like Women Under Siege, and get some information out there in the world. And so I think there are lots of really wonderful opportunities. I think the challenge from the academic point of view is a lot of that kind of work doesn't count. And so in a way you're flying in the face of academic traditions and what counts for tenure and all that sort of thing. But I think increasingly actually as more academics do this, it's changing the culture. So I think actually, even within this current year, I've seen a change at Emory about the regard for public scholarship.
And interestingly, I think just talking about Women Under Siege, while so many of you are journalists in the room, I sort of want to encourage you to think creatively after your fellowship. That, I was coming from sort of a traditional journalism background, but was given the opportunity by the Women's Media Center to create this kind of new platform, and I designed it from nothing, just having this kind of imperative from Gloria to think about this topic, and then created a site, a repository for all kinds of journalism. And we've had, people like Maria Hinojosa, Lara Logan, whoever, writing for us as journalists, but we've also had academics who are able to contribute, and hopefully we're translating it for a journalism audience. So I think in terms of like new media, there's so much to be done out there still, because it's, you can work through traditional realms, as I also do, but I love having this other thing that stands alone as kind of its own interesting kind of journalism. The other thing I wanted to add, though, what you were saying about kind of being in a sea of like first-person narrative and like just everyone's a journalist now, the thing that sets good journalism apart to me is news judgment. And it's like the analysis you do, it's the thought you give to what's behind it, the context, and it's really hard to find still. So just to transition from that, so part of what I do is document sexualized violence in Syria, and I use Ushahidi, which is a crowd mapping platform. And I was super excited. It was 3 years ago, I don't know, that we started it. And I was excited to start getting reports in. We showed people how to report anonymously, and we didn't think we'd have like rape survivors in Syria being like, I was raped, but I thought we'd have secondhand or thirdhand, maybe the doctors who were treating them would start using it, and we did kind of an outreach campaign. In those 3 years, we have had literally a handful of people use it that way. So I am using this super cutting edge technology, and there have been like 1,000 articles written about us using this awesome technology, but in the end, it is old school journalism. I go to the region, I do my reporting, I enter my cases in like as small news reports, and we are culling information from NGOs and from other news outlets. So it's interesting because I tried to go into the most like interesting kind of data new media thing, and it still relies on that news judgment and on the ground reporting. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, I take from the discussion the tension that apparently exists between research and journalism, given the the nature of the two professions. What I can add is that during my 3 months fellowship in Oxford, my colleagues who were all researchers introduced me to the others. No, she's a real person. She's not an academic, she's a real person. I'm not convinced that this was something commendable. So now the real person me is turning back to you to this challenging challenges and opportunities things. You mentioned already things that are more easily done with the new technologies, things where new technologies cannot bring anything else but, speed or convenience. If it was to just pick the worst and the best of the new technologies, what would be that?
So I basically just crapped on my own project, which is not what I meant to do.
It happens to all of us.
So pulling back, she reminded me that there are very good upsides to this project, but the majority of which is that by using this interesting technology, we have drawn attention in a way that we could not have. I have this map, it's got these red dots, it makes front pages of newspapers because it's, a strange new thing, which now you're seeing more of them, but when we started, there were not so many of those in the news. So, using a map with a fancy piece of technology has made people pay attention to sexualized violence and conflict. And of course, I've coupled that with, reports on our site, a report in the Atlantic, where, trying to get hardcore media stories to accompany, analysis of what we've got on this map. So I think the pairing has been really important.
I'm actually going to take, I'm going to do the two downsides because I was doing the opportunities earlier. One I found is again a tension between academic research and what maybe editors, I'm not necessarily journalists, but the editors behind the journalists feel like the public wants to hear. So for example, when Ellen Johnson Sirleaf of Liberia got the Nobel Peace Prize, I wrote an article that was actually quite critical of her work and sent it off to Ms. Magazine, and they said, oh, no, we don't do criticism of famous women, we want more support. And I was like, okay, now it could have just been that, but it was like, really? I mean, I'm kind of a fan, but it was a more reflective, critical piece. Anyway, so that didn't work well. And then just another downside, which you might have experienced yourself, we were talking earlier, is that certainly on Twitter, where I'm very active, or too active, I should be doing other work.
That's how we met.
But on Twitter, and as a result of articles, is that it turns out that whatever women write, it really doesn't matter whether you're writing about a problem with plumbing or sexual violence or the weather, is the trolls come out and attack you. So I'm a great fan of Mary Beard, who is the professor of Roman history at Cambridge, I think it is. And she's been vilely attacked because she's 60, has grey hair, and really doesn't care what she looks like. She's an expert on the Roman Empire, and she literally gets comments and tweets like, quote, I'm going to chop your head off and rape it. Literally. And you think, what? Because she dares to appear in her trousers and a jersey talking about fascinating Roman temples or something, she gets a comment like that, and so that is, I think, one of the downsides, is it's actually I found it really quite depressing, the level of misogyny out there. There are men who hate women.
Have any of you besides me had your photo posted on Twitter and been called ugly just because you wrote an article? Because that's what happened. I mean, literally, I can write about anything and get.
We are not that important.
Yeah, I think that to me that's the downside. The upside is you have people like Mary Beard speaking back to the people who say they want to rape her head, and she's really out there changing, I think, the culture and saying, don't take this, if people want to say that kind of thing, we have a right to speak back. So on one level it's empowering, but I can just get really depressed. That, like, really? You really want to spend your time saying that to people just because they wrote about anything? Yeah, so I'm sorry, I can't, yeah. Well.
So I'm also going to focus on two negatives. Okay. The positives. So I just want to take a quick poll. Most of you are journalists. How many of you use numbers in the work that you do? Numbers, yes. Figures, statistics, etc. So the downside that I want to talk about is the possibility of inflating numbers. So especially with relating to sexualized violence, if you talk about a situation, say the DRC, you want to know, well, how many women have been raped, right? That's the first question often that comes to people's minds. And so one of the problems with having access to these kinds of numbers because of new media or whatever is this downward spiral of, it's a downward spiral towards trying to get towards the highest number, right? So the more traumatic or the worse the situation, the more likely that you're going to draw attention to it. And so it's an incentive to try to play up the numbers, to inflate the numbers, but what you're actually doing then is creating this hierarchy of conflicts. So if the actual number in a place like, I don't know, the US, say, on college campuses is a lot lower than the DRC, then it's not considered as the same magnitude when it very well could be, right? So you're creating a competition of numbers so it's something to be careful of, and a potential negative downfall. The other negative that I want to draw attention to is as we're using new technology and media sources, we might be creating a bigger distance between us and the people that we're writing about, right? So a lot of the people maybe are illiterate, don't have access to the internet, et cetera, and so how do we then bring the information that we're writing about back to the people that we're writing about? Mm-hmm. And so it has the potential to create more of a distance, I think.
So over the years, I've done a lot of work in the area of child welfare generally, and particularly in different state situations, and I've been writing a lot over the last year or two. And what I found is the ability to gather information to engage people who might want to tell their story has been greatly helped by Facebook, either on my own page or pages that deal with the issues that I'm looking at, or old-fashioned listservs of groups. But these kinds of just pedestrian ways of using the internet I've found to be very helpful. But for some time I had an idea about written about the use of restraints with kids in school and seclusion rooms, and of trying to do like a national sort of overview and having state by state, and if you had information, and it was a fairly ambitious idea, but didn't get beyond that. And then ProPublica did a site like that for a joint story they did with National Public Radio. And if you're looking for something that sort of shows what you can do with the internet that sort of takes it beyond just traditional reporting, it's fairly breathtaking. They have state-by-state breakouts. If you have a story you want to tell, they will hook you up with a local reporter in your area. You can find out what's going on. And it's really used, I think, the full power of the internet to take one story and then to augment the reporting that was done by NPR on this to create this kind of platform that I was just really impressed with what they were able to do with it. I do think it's interesting, I think for me, the Ray Rice story and the Adrian Peterson child abuse story, it's hit me as probably the first major story, and maybe Ferguson, those three, that I've really consumed as a news consumer in a world beyond traditional media. But even with Ferguson, I'd watch some of the news reports. I think with the Ray Rice story and the Peterson story, almost everything that I've read has been something that somebody has said on Facebook or an article they've linked to. I've learned a lot about the Danish, I think, author who wrote Pippi Longstockings, who became a big advocate for not using corporal punishment. But I've really taken in those two stories, which are very important stories, really apart from traditional mainstream news reporting. So it's an interesting sort of window on how we're taking in information. And in some ways, it's much more of a discussion that you're a part of than being a one-way consumer of information. But I do think at the end of the day, there's a need for just on-the-ground, solid, reporting that you can count on as well to drive important stories.
Thank you very much. We have a couple of minutes for questions from our distinguished audience.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.